The sky above Nere's 4 burned like a wound torn open in space, smearing crimson fire across the husk of a once thriving outpost. Ash rained down through shattered steel girders and jagged rock, the air thick with the chemical tang of scorched polymers and plasma discharges. Kael Vorn crouched behind the remains of a smoldering turret emplacement, his combat armor blistered and blackened, his pulse rifle nearly spent. The Dominion's orbital strike had been absolute, sterilizing the Volari settlement with surgical cruelty. This was supposed to be a neutral supply stop, a waypoint for trade diplomacy, maybe even peace. Now it was nothing but molten ruins and silence thickened by death. But even through the smoke, something stirred. A faint signal. Movement impossible but real, pinging softly on the cracked screen of Kael's wrist console. Life, not Dominion, not machine. Something else. He vaulted from cover with a grunt, cutting through flame and debris with grim determination. Every step was a gamble against gravity and collapse, but he moved like a ghost over steel bones. Then just ahead, beneath the warped skeleton of a former communications tower, came a sound. Not a scream, not a call for help. A voice. Melodic, shaking, but alive. He burst into the chamber, swept his weapon forward, then froze. There, crouched beneath a half-toppled console, was a Volari woman shielding 2 children with her body. Her skin, a dusky emerald threaded with faint silver bioluminescence, was covered in soot and ash. One amber eye locked onto him with defiant clarity, while the other trembled with recognition. Kael's breath hitched. She wasn't just protecting them, she was daring the fire, daring the collapsing heavens themselves to touch her kin. For a moment, nothing existed but the unspoken question that hung between them. He was human. She was Volari. Their peoples had signed accords, broken them, fought, rebuilt, then betrayed again. And yet, his hands moved before his brain caught up, slinging the rifle and drawing 2 emergency foam charges from his belt. He doused the wreckage overhead in thermal suppressant, ignoring the hiss of steam against his armor, the cracking groan of metal surrendering to gravity. He grabbed the fallen beam and pulled muscles, screaming fingertips blistering beneath armored gloves. The woman joined him. No words, just motion, power, urgency. Together they lifted just enough for the children, one trembling and small, the other with a hardened stare far beyond his years, to scurry into the gap Kael had indicated. The woman hesitated only a heartbeat, her amber gaze searching his face for lies or weakness. Finding none, she followed. Kael dove last, the ceiling giving way behind him in a roar of ruin. They landed hard outside, coughing through smoke, the shimmer of his shield generator flickering out, just as burning debris rained down like judgment. His body curved instinctively over hers. Not strategy, instinct. Her breath warmed the crook of his neck. The moment held like gravity, suspended in defiance of time. Then she pulled away, rising to gather her children, her eyes never leaving his. In that stare was something ancient and aching, not gratitude, but recognition. He had shielded them, not as a soldier, not as an operative, but as a man who had nothing to gain. And that simple act shifted the foundation of everything she'd been taught to expect from his kind. They moved. There was no plan, only momentum. Kael led them through a corridor of ruin, across cooling slag, and between the broken teeth of buildings that once shimmered with light and laughter. The Dominions still circled overhead, but the shadows of an abandoned mining facility offered a sliver of hope. Within that rusted maze of forgotten machines, Kael found a chamber, still intact, a curved shell of processed alloy buried deep beneath the surface. It would do. As he secured the perimeter, he watched her collapse against an overturned beam, exhaustion finally demanding payment. A gash along her arm oozed through tattered fabric. He crossed to her hands, moving automatically, his field medic training rising from muscle memory. Her children watched silently, one gripping the other's hand. She winced, but did not pull away. His hands were gentle, too gentle for someone who had just escaped death. Her skin beneath his fingers was warm, pulsing with life, not so unlike his own. She studied him as he worked the scar along his jaw, the way his eyes never stopped scanning even as he dressed her wound. He was built for war, but his hands held her as if she were sacred. The fire outside had dimmed to a distant glow, but the heat between them remained. She told him her name, Elyra T'Marei, matriarch once, now exile. Her voice was steady, her words chosen with the precision of one used to command, not apology. She told him of betrayal cloaked in tradition, of a forced bond she'd rejected, of exile with children and assassins close behind. He listened silent and still. When she finished, he offered no pity, only truth. That her survival was not shame, but strength. That protecting one's children was not selfishness, but sacred. That she had been braver than the armies who had banished her. She did not cry, but her breath caught in a way that said she wanted to. Instead, she pressed her hand against his, not for comfort, for certainty, and he did not move away. Outside, the world burned. Inside, something else began. The air grew colder as the fires of the outpost receded behind them, swallowed by the horizon of twisted ruins and cooling ash. In the shelter of the derelict mining facility, Kael Vorn began to chart an extraction route, but his eyes kept drifting back to the Valari woman, now tending to her children, with hands that trembled only once the adrenaline had ebbed. Elyra T'Marei. He repeated the name silently, committing the shape of it to memory like a tactical code, but it felt heavier than any designation he'd ever carried. She moved like a soldier, spoke like a diplomat, and guarded her children with the fury of an empire. Kael had seen many things in war, but not that, not this. Her son Dren, sharp-eyed, wary, watched him with suspicion, dulled only by fatigue. The younger one, Lyra, had curled beside Elyra and drifted into the kind of sleep only children can manage after witnessing destruction. Kael stood guard, not because he had orders or duty or even a plan anymore, because she had placed her trust in him with a glance, and somehow that weighed more than 1,000 commands from command centers light years away. Dawn on Neres 4 spilled across the horizon like molten glass. Elyra rose without sound, moving beside him. Their eyes met her gaze, questioning but not hostile. She asked nothing. He offered nothing. Yet in that silence, something deepened. They left the mining camp before Dominion patrols could double back. The terrain was punishing fractured stone vertical climbs, tight crevices, where entire mountain faces had collapsed inward from orbital bombardment. Kael moved with discipline, helping the children over razor-backed formations, cutting footholds into unstable ridgelines. Elyra navigated like she had lived in these wild crags for years, her balance unnerving, her strength unexpected. More than once, she steadied Kael not with pride, but with a quiet efficiency that made it feel like partnership instead of weakness. At a narrow ledge overlooking a chasm, Kael's hands slipped the blood from old cuts reopening against the sharp rock. Lyra gasped. Elyra reacted immediately. Her hand seized his, pulling him to balance her other, already retrieving a small vial from her pack. The salve smelled like crushed minerals and ozone. It cooled the pain instantly. She applied it without hesitation, her fingers moving over his skin with precision and pressure. Not intimate, not romantic, but something worse. Trusting. Kael said nothing, but his breath caught as she leaned over his hands, her concentration folding a strand of hair across her face. He could feel the heat from her, the pulse beneath her skin, the awareness between them crackling like static in dry air. It wasn't love. It wasn't lust. It was something older than either. When Dren announced an incoming scout ship, they froze in synchronicity, backs pressed to stone movement, minimized. Kael counted timing patterns, recalculated. Elyra listened and watched. She understood the Dominion well. Too well. He assembled an EMP disruptor from scavenged components, a small trick he'd used on more than one incursion. She asked what it was. He explained. She nodded. No awe, no skepticism, just understanding. He pointed to the location. Dangerous. She didn't flinch. He made the run under the sensor sweep, planted the device, returned through blind spots he'd memorized by heart. She didn't say a word when he landed beside her again, his breath ragged. Just looked at him once like she knew more than he'd said. When the scout ship veered off, its systems scrambled. Her eyes caught his. Admiration bloomed quiet and restrained, but there. As they climbed toward the ancient Valari temple, Elyra had remembered from her childhood, the terrain grew sacred and strange. The rock formations were carved by hand and history spires that curved like frozen fire glyphs, embedded into cliff faces like veins of silver. Even the wind whispered in tones that didn't belong to science. The temple had been abandoned for centuries, yet its heart still pulsed with memory. The children moved through the outer chambers in awed silence. Kael secured the perimeter, instinctively noting choke points, blind angles, fallback positions. He didn't know why he was so meticulous, only that every action now centered on keeping her safe. Elyra moved deeper into the temple, drawn by something Kael couldn't name. He followed slower, letting her walk ahead. At the far end of the sanctuary chamber, she sat in a shaft of filtered light fingers, closed around a silver pendant that shimmered with motionless energy. She didn't speak. Neither did he. But when he sat beside her, it was not an intrusion. It was necessary. She held the pendant like a wound or a memory, or both. Then, after a long silence, she opened the story of her past, not as confession, but as release. She had once been heir to a clan that demanded alliance over agency. Her refusal to marry Rex Valen had cost her titles, her people, and nearly her life. Kael listened. He didn't reach out, he didn't console, but she could feel it, the depth of his understanding, the ache he carried too. She looked at him and asked, not with words, but with the tilt of her head and the tension of her jaw. "Do you think less of me?" He answered by simply remaining, not moving away, not offering judgment. She looked down at her children through a crack in the stone floor and whispered that she had survived only because she had chosen them over everything else. Kael closed his hand around hers, not as comfort but solidarity, and she didn't pull away. The heart of the temple beat with a silence that pressed into the bones. Elyra led them deeper into its corridors, moving without words, her steps guided by instinct as much as memory. The architecture shifted from sacred austerity to something more intimate. Walls curved in organic spirals, the floors etched with latticework patterns that shimmered faintly beneath their boots. The glyphs pulsed dimly when touched, their energy ancient and patient. It was not the grandeur of forgotten gods that greeted them at the temple's core, but the hush of buried technology. In a chamber untouched by time, Kael discovered the structure, a crescent-shaped altar fused with crystalline consoles, metallic tendrils trailing into the floor. He scanned it with his gear, but the readings were incomprehensible. It was Valari biotech, predating even the war. Elyra approached her breath, hitching at the sight of the familiar emblem engraved at the base. Her family crest, not seen since before her exile. The altar lit softly as she neared, recognizing her biosignature, but the glow flickered erratically. The system was damaged. Ancient. Still functional, but barely. Behind her, Lyra's breath came in shallow gasps, her body slumping with exhaustion beyond what rest could heal. The climb, the fear, the unprocessed trauma, it was too much for her child's physiology. Elyra knelt beside her, voice calm, but her hands shook. Kael scanned vitals, cross-referencing symptoms. The child's blood oxygen saturation had dropped dangerously low. Air composition, environmental degradation, no filtration this deep. She needed medical support immediately. Elyra's gaze fell on the chamber's biocore, then locked with his. There was no other choice. The system was a regeneration pod, half-healing chamber, half-genetic recalibrator, but it required a second host to stabilize its protocols. Valari physiology was genetically bound to neural resonance. The pod couldn't complete the sequence without a linked counterpart. It had been designed for bonded pairs. Elyra's hand trembled as it hovered over the activation room. She turned toward him. There were no words exchanged, but everything else was said. He stepped forward. She adjusted the parameters on the control node. The system required neural synchronization and partial genetic imprinting. Kael didn't pretend to understand the biology, but he understood the stakes. The pod opened with a hiss. The interior was lined with pulsing biogel tendrils of light drifting across its surface like languid neurons. Elyra entered first, her body relaxing into the structure as if returning home. Kael followed, seating himself opposite her. The moment their skin made contact, the chamber sealed shut. Warmth flooded him, not physical, but something deeper. A pull. The sensation of two minds touching at the edges. Not merging, not yet, but testing alignment. The system asked no questions, but it didn't need to. It acted. His vitals synced with hers. Pulse patterns equalized. Neural oscillations mirrored. The chamber pulsed once, and then opened every door inside him. Not memories exactly, but emotional anchors. Pain buried in movement. Grief tucked between scars. Moments of light in an otherwise dim path. And hers met his streams of regret, braided with resolve. Images of a childhood abandoned a throne, refused a blade raised in a dark corridor to shield a child she had barely birthed. They saw one another, not in fragments, but whole. The pod sealed tighter. The biogel shifted, adapting. Their bodies adjusted under its influence molecules, responding to the harmonics of shared emotion. Heat rose between them, not artificial, not arousal, but convergence. Her fingers brushed his across the pod's pulse field. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't platonic. It was something older than both. A recognition born of fire and silence. Then the shift began. Light enveloped them, threads of energy weaving between their nervous systems. There was no pain, but neither was there comfort. There was only becoming. His body resisted human cells skeptical of alien symbiosis, but her presence steadied him. Her mind, brushing against his like wind over glass, reminded him how to breathe. His genome adjusted, borrowing just enough to stabilize her child. Her biocode flexed, allowing temporary integration. It was meant to be temporary. It was not. When the pod disengaged, they staggered out into the chamber, half carried by one another. Lyra's breathing had stabilized, her pulse strong, the light in her skin soft and steady. Elyra touched her daughter's forehead, her own energy vibrating faintly in resonance. She turned to Kael and knew, without translation or science, that something permanent had taken root. Not love, not yet, but a bond formed in blood and fire, anchored by trust and made physical by ancient design. They didn't speak as they left the healing chamber, but they moved closer now. Their steps adjusted to each other. Their glances lingered, their silences aligned. And somewhere deep in the ruined temple, the resonance of their shared transformation hummed a tone older than language. Something had changed, forever. The wind across the temple ridge carried no scent, but it moved with urgency, slicing through the high canyons like a warning. The Dominion's aerial patrols had grown erratic evidence that their sensors had picked up conflicting data. Kael Vorn moved with purpose, now his stride tighter calibrated, not just for speed, but alignment. Beside him, Elyra T'Marei moved in a rhythm so matched that they no longer needed to speak. Their bond, born in the healing chamber, had altered more than physiology. It had shifted perception. Time had begun to blur between them, awareness folding over, like pages in a book they read together. He felt her unease before she voiced it. She sensed his calculations before he gave them form. They were not telepathic, they were resonant. It manifested first in combat. When the first hunter squad struck from the cliffs above, there was no command issued, no cry of warning. Elyra pivoted before Kael fired. Her hands moved in arcs that matched his trajectories. They struck in tandem, her plasma blades slashing through shadow as his kinetic rounds cracked into chest plates. The attackers never had a chance to regroup. When it ended, the ground was slick with melted armor and the copper tang of ozone. They stood back to back, breathing hard, their forms outlined in the shifting glow of the canyon's dusk. The children remained hidden, untouched. Elyra's eyes burned with something more than adrenaline. Kael didn't meet her gaze, not yet. The next wave came faster, more coordinated. Dominion shock units modified with jump gear and integrated AI. But Kael's reflexes had become something more. He sensed vectors not just with his training, but through the pulse he shared with her. He could feel where she would move before her muscles twitched. His hand threw a charge as hers activated a field disruptor. His rifle barked as her blade caught the reflection of firelight. They were no longer two soldiers reacting. They were one system of response. One living organism split across two bodies. The Dominion fell back. They weren't prepared for this. No one was. They made camp that night beneath a fractured dome where starlight filtered through crystalline gaps in the ceiling. Dren took first watch, his young face set with a fierceness that came not from innocence lost, but identity reclaimed. Lyra curled against her mother's side, already asleep. Kael studied the stars through a broken sliver of sky, tracking the arc of a drone too distant to target. Elyra sat beside him, not touching, but not apart. The silence between them was weighted now, not with what had passed, but what might come. He felt the pull of her thoughts like a tide at his back. They had touched without touching, shared without speaking, and now what began as a survival act lingered as something else. When he reached into his pack to recalibrate his field scanner, her hand moved too. Their fingers touched. A brief connection, electric and quiet. Neither pulled away. When the final hunter team descended at dawn, they met them not as prey but as predators. The fight unfolded with a precision Kael had never experienced. The ground around them became choreography. Flank, cover, surge, retreat, re-engage. She was no longer adapting to his tactics. He was moving in hers, and she in his. When the last enemy fell, Elyra landed a final arc of her blade across an officer's breastplate, its energy flaring bright enough to light the carved walls around them. Kael covered her back without needing to look. Their breath came in synchrony. Neither spoke, but the bond throbbed between them deeper than blood, older than code. Afterward, in the silence of spent adrenaline, he noticed something in the air. A pattern, a pulse. The machines embedded in the temple's walls had reactivated. Sensors dormant for centuries now tracked their movements, responded to their biosignatures. Together, they had triggered a forgotten failsafe. He examined the glyphs, defense networks, tactical overlays, energy routes designed not for weapons but for synchronization. The temple hadn't been a sanctuary. It had been a crucible, designed to find a match. Elyra's hand brushed against the wall beside his. The system responded, casting light patterns across the floor battle formations keyed to twin biometrics. Her breath hitched, not from fear, but comprehension. They were chosen, not by prophecy, but by compatibility. She turned toward him. For the first time, no weight of exile, no burden of children, no armor of duty masked her expression, only revelation. He met her eyes and saw not the alien, the exile, the threat, but the other half of a circuit neither had known they were missing. The temple knew, the bond knew, and now they did too. The wind had shifted, not just in direction, but in consequence. Across the fractured terrain of Neri's 4 fires were no longer signs of ruin, but signals, calls to arms igniting across forgotten sectors. The Dominion's grip was unraveling, and it had begun with a voice. Her voice. Elyra T'Marei stood at the center of a repurposed relay station, her image casting itself across planetary bands and satellite channels in crystal clarity. Around her, the control panels of Dominion communication architecture pulsed with light, not of their own design, but repurposed by Kael's adjustments, subtle frequencies altered, command protocols inverted. Her message spread like a living thing. She spoke not as a mother, not as a fugitive, but as matriarch, once exiled and now returned. She did not plead. She did not rage. She stated that the Dominion's time was done, that Valari soil belonged to its people, that exile could no longer serve as political punishment for conscience. Her voice, sharpened by sorrow and burnished by survival, reached not only her people, but every other world watching. Simultaneously, Kael Vorn moved through the underlevels of the compound, placing detonation charges and scrambling reinforcement signals. Every movement had purpose. Every calculation led to time 15 minutes, no more. Elyra had to finish the message and escape before the Dominion wiped the station from orbit. He reached the final corridor just as resistance fighters arrived at the rally point, providing suppression fire. But Elyra had not emerged. Static choked her comm frequency. He called her name. No answer. Then the silence broke. Her voice, strained but firm, replied from the 3rd level. She was trapped. Dominion reinforcements had sealed the exits. His breath hardened into steel. He moved. Down halls lit by emergency strobes. Through gunfire. Through smoke. Through memories not yet made. He found her with two others, barricaded behind collapsed plating, holding the line with precision and control. She didn't ask why he'd come. She had known he would. Their eyes locked for a half-beat before he initiated their escape. His mind already calculating vectors, pressure limits, structural faults. They moved, as one, every turn predicted, every cover synchronized. Resistance units closed in from the flanks, buying them seconds at a time. But it was enough. When the final blast cut off the last pursuing team, they emerged onto the platform where transport waited, already igniting. Kael guided her on board shielded Lyra and Dren as they scrambled into harnesses. Elyra took command mid-flight, directing troops, rerouting air units, ordering fallback zones and rally beacons without once faltering. Her voice filled every channel. Tactical, commanding, alive. Across the skies, Dominion fortresses trembled. Supply lines cracked, colonies revolted. Soldiers laid down arms not out of fear, but from hearing a message that resonated deeper than orders. A message that came from one who had lost everything and still stood. In the hours that followed, uplink nodes reported successful coordination from 17 sectors. Communications shattered, defensive positions abandoned. Command collapsed under the weight of its own assumptions. But more than that, hope spread. Measurable, kinetic, irreversible. On the deck of the extraction ship, Kael watched her. Exhausted, bloodied, but whole. Her fingers wrapped around his without ceremony. No declaration was needed. Their bond had deepened in battle, forged not only in survival but in resistance. They had not just escaped. They had ignited something elemental. Across Luma, colonies began to rise. Silence no longer reigned. And at the center of it, her voice carried by his hands, protected by their unity. Not just soldiers, not just symbols, but convergence. They had not won, not yet. But they had changed the ending. And for the Dominion, that was the beginning of the end. The skies above Lumara no longer burned with orbital flame. They shimmered with the arrival of voices once silenced, of banners, once hidden, of alliances born not from treaties, but shared defiance. 6 months had passed since the fall of Dominion authority on Neris IV, and the echoes of revolution had stretched far beyond that one planet's soil. Now, an orbital station, sleek and silver, hung over the restored capital like a sentinel of the new age. Within its transparent dome stood Kael Vorn armor, replaced by black diplomatic garb, reinforced with plated underlays, his pulse calm but vigilant. The view revealed shuttles arriving from across the Sector 12 worlds, once fractured by distrust, now converging to ratify a future built in the shadow of shared war. Behind him she entered. Elyra T'Marei. Her formal robes fused Valari ceremonial structure with the practicality of resistance wear. Every step she took was weighted with more than authority. It carried survival, conviction, motherhood memory. Her presence pulled his gaze like gravity. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She moved beside him, and for a moment, they watched in silence as a shuttle docked its occupants, emerging. Andromedan's Solarian envoys, even Dominion defectors offering cautious hope. All of them had heard her broadcast. All had watched the fall of Dominion command. All had seen her and him standing not as conquerors, but as proof. Kael's fingers brushed against hers where they hung at their sides. The contact was small, but it centered them. Their child, the bond-born symbol of this new order, remained planetside with Dren, now a sentinel in training. Lyra had taken to planetary architecture, helping reshape the ruins of their former exile into the heart of Lumara's capital. The future, quite literally, was growing in their hands. As the diplomatic chamber filled, Kael and Elyra took their place at the central table. The Accord of Lumina, projected in soft light across the holotable, waited for final confirmation. Articles had been debated, amended, refined. But one remained untouched, Article 7. The abolition of exile as political punishment. Kael watched Elyra as her eyes lingered on that clause, not with regret, with purpose. Across from them sat Elder Yara, the oldest of the former exiles, her voice thin but steady as she called the meeting to order. Elyra rose first, her speech brief. No declarations, no poetry, just truth. That strength must serve justice. That difference must not be punished. That survival must lead to more than silence. When she sat, Kael stood. His words were simpler still. That he had come to a world to follow orders and instead had followed a voice. That in protecting that voice he had found not just purpose but a future, not as a soldier, as a man. As they signed the accord, hand after hand, adding their imprint to the document's binding code, a ripple passed through the chamber. Not noise, not applause, but something heavier. Resolution. Outside, thousands gathered in the city below, their faces upturned toward the orbital station. Watching. Waiting. Elyra and Kael stepped out onto the observation platform. The crowd erupted not as worshippers, but as partners, as citizens of something new. He turned toward her as the roar of voices filled the sky. She leaned closer, not for ceremony, but for certainty. He asked nothing, but her hand found his. The silence between them no longer held tension, only peace. The world below shimmered with promise, and above it together they stood. In the heart of devastation, a single act of humanity ignited a sequence that reshaped a galaxy. Kael Vorn, a lone human soldier hardened by duty, found not an enemy in the ruins of Nari's 4, but a mother, a leader, and a future in Elyra T'Marei, once exiled, now eternal. Together, they transcended war biology and politics through a bond that began with survival and became revolution. What started as a rescue became alliance. What began as trust became resonance. And what sparked between them became not just love, but a force powerful enough to rewrite the fate of worlds. This was not a story of conquest, it was a story of convergence. If you've felt the pulse of this journey through your screen, through fire, betrayal, unity, and triumph, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with fellow sci-fi lovers who believe in love forged on the battlefield and alliances born in ash. Comment below. Would you trust a stranger to rewrite your fate? Would you fight for someone you just met but couldn't forget? Until the next resonance, this is HFY Cinema. Stay strong, stay strange, stay human.